This is a University of Otago podcast.
I'll just get myself set up here. All right, yes, so I am the other author, working with Glenn Boyle. Glenn Boyle used to be at Otago. He is now at Canterbury after a short time in Wellington. All right, so I'm going to look at executive compensation. I've been working on a data set since 1997. As Eric mentioned, that was when the New Zealand Companies Act first made compensation payments to publicly listed companies a legal requirement that it be disclosed in the financial reports. Before that time, nobody really knew what these individuals were being paid or indeed how that pay was being determined. So before I get to my data set, I just want to highlight the fact that the CEO pay ratio has been in the news recently. I don't know how many of you know about Gravity Payments. It's a small to medium-sized company that manages credit card payments. It's based in Seattle, and the entrepreneurial CEO, Dan Price, on April 13th actually announced that within 3 years he wants every employee in his company to be earning at least $70,000 a year. And there's a nice link here around the motivation as to why he decided to make that decision. And essentially it will require that his company cut some profits, and he's going to actually drop his salary from $1 million down to $70,000. Now, I'll see if this is going to work. Hopefully it will. It's just very short. Volume up. Sorry, I'm too loud. It's always an ad, sorry. It's quite short. And just while we're listening to the ad, the CEO pay ratio has become an issue in the US, again, as Eric has pointed out, because of the significant gap in the level of pay to top executives compared to sort of the rank and file workers. Oh, I can skip the ad. There we go. Now, I should be able to make this full screen somehow. Oh, down there? Oh, great.
And we're going to have a minimum $70,000 pay rate for everyone that works here. It's going to go into effect over the next 3 years or so. Starting today, everybody in the company that makes under $50,000 a year is automatically going to make the greater of $50,000 a year or $3,000 more than you're making today. Or excuse me, $5,000 more than you're making today. So if you're making 48, then you would go to 53. If you're making 45 or less, then you would go to 50. And then starting December of next year, the minimum has to be $60,000 per year. So everyone that works here has to make at least $60,000 per year. And it's a requirement, I'm putting on myself and on the company. And then starting December of the following year, it has to be $70,000, which I think is actually the really exciting number that I'd be happy about. Now, there are risks associated with this, and I'm sure there's lots of questions which we can get to, and we have time for Q&A. But one of the things to try to offset that risk, my pay is set based on market rates and kind of what it would take to replace me. And because of this growing inequality as a CEO, that amount is really, really high. I make, my compensation is really high. And so I'm actually taking my salary down to the minimum salary as well until our profit goes back up to where it is before we made this policy change.
That pretty much sums it up. And actually what is interesting is in 2010, under the Obama administration, the Dodd-Frank law was instigated following the crises that was a result of the global financial collapse, requiring that the CEO pay ratio, the ratio of the CEO's pay relative to an average employee of the company, be disclosed in the financial reports. But as yet, no publicly listed company in the US has met that legal requirement. And actually, the governance debate is still going on as to whether disclosing that number would be beneficial, the cost required to gather the information to be able to disclose that number in a way that would be meaningful to the readers of those financial statements, is being argued, is going to be too difficult to do. So at present, nobody in the US actually knows what that ratio is, and there's again quite a big gap depending on which company you're looking at. Ralph mentioned the Microsoft salary, yes. Oracle, Starbucks, Disney, any of those CEOs, that ratio is like 2,000 times at least when you look at typical average employee income. So there's quite an interesting media debate going on over the requirement for disclosure of that information and whether or not it will be met. So, and that's a legal requirement. So it's interesting that that is ongoing. So with that sort of in the background, let me now move to my sample. I have a sample that starts in 1997 when the information first became public, and it's current up to 2012. It's still being updated for 2013. We take out any institution that is a finance-related operation, so insurance companies, banks, trusts, property investment companies are removed, and we take out any firms which can't be included, for example, if they change their balance date or if their CEO changes during the financial year. So there's not a full disclosure. At the moment, that data set has 1,158 firm year observations, so it's quite a substantial database. There are disclosures of New Zealand compensation now available through certain databases, but you need to be careful using them because payments might be made in this financial year, but they actually refer back to previous financial years. So you need to understand what you're reading, and you need to understand what's being disclosed, because these payments include both cash and other equity incentives. So here's just a picture of what we see in the New Zealand environment at the moment. So you can see there's quite a range, a minimum of 60,000 in 1997 through to a maximum of 1.5 million. I should explain that these are real numbers, so they are all adjusted for inflation in terms of 1997 dollars, so you can compare a number in 2004 directly with the number in 1997. And you can see that there's some standard deviation, and the number of firms varies, and that again is based on firms entering and leaving the exchange, and also changes in CEO, changes in balance dates. But it's quite a rich data set. This is only cash compensation, so on top of that, these individuals will also have some sort of equity incentive, which could be in the form of a share plan. So they get to own a certain number of shares within a certain period of time if they meet some performance indicators, and or options. So an option gives the individual the right to buy shares in the future, provided the share price achieves a certain level. What does worker income look like in comparison? So I go to the Statistics New Zealand database and I look at median levels of worker income based on the annual income survey, and you can see they're fairly low, and again these are in real terms. So for example, in 2012, mean annual worker income for that year was around $50,000 before adjusting for inflation. All right, so that will give you sort of some idea of the sorts of numbers we're dealing with. Now, I should tell you something about CEO pay disclosure. Eric made a really good point before when he said, well, you know, shareholders, if they're really concerned about how the firm is doing and how well that person who's been employed to manage their assets and maximise their value is doing that job, they should be watching what's happening to that firm and watching how that person's been compensated. But in fact, it's quite difficult to read financial statements. And for someone who isn't trained in accounting or has minimum knowledge of how information is disclosed in financial statements, it can be very difficult and often quite confusing. Add to that the fact that in New Zealand, even though there is now a legal requirement under the Companies Act to disclose this information, it is actually only required if you are on the board. So if you are a CEO who is not a director, then your total compensation package does not have to be directly reported in the financial statements. What the requirement does, it asks that if any employee who earns more than $100,000, the pay level must be reported and the number of employees earning that pay level in $10,000 bandwidths. So if I was paid $1.5 million last year, but I was a CEO, I was not a director, then my pay would be reported, if I was the only individual in that pay bracket, as one person who earned between 1.4 and 1.5 million, for example. well, actually, it wouldn't be quite like that. It'd be 1.5 million, 1.5 million, 100,000. Yeah, so it's in steps of 100,000s. All right, so again, it's not very transparent and oftentimes can be quite confusing because there are other executives in the organisation who may be paid more than the CEO, so we can't always identify who the CEO is. All right, so there's a query around transparency. So if the shareholder is able to, they may be able to identify the information, but then being able to understand what it means and how it relates back to firm performance can confound that ability to be able to act on performance which they feel is not necessarily maximising shareholder value. So what I want to do is show you 3 examples of how this information is disclosed. So the first example is from Auckland International Airport, which has a majority shareholder, which is the Auckland or Manukau City Council. And this is from 2012. Adrian Littlewood was appointed, and the CFO of that organisation is Simon Robertson. He is also a very well paid member of that executive team. So I'm just going to show you 2 financial statements. Why will it not open that? It worked before. I have to put this back in. Let me just put this in and see if this will. Let's see. It might. Great. All right, so I'm just going to scroll down, and as I scroll down, you'll see the amount of information that is in these documents is quite hefty, and it's all very fine print, lots of details relating to numbers. I'm just going to look for remuneration. All right. So I've got a page number in mind. So a bit further. 123. Okay, so it's just in here. All right, so there's the listing of individuals. You can see, so 23 people earn between 100 and 110,000. So as we go down, you see one person earned between 1.15 and 1.16 million in 2013. So what I wanted to point out is that this individual, Mr. Littlewood, there's very little direct information about him because he's a CEO, but he is not on the board of directors. So if you want to find out how he was paid, then you have to wade through the documentation that's in this section of the report. And it talks here about some of the equity incentives. They issue phantom options, which is like an option, but you never receive the option. You just get the cash value of the option if it can be exercised. And they talk about how that's valued. And if you look really closely, there's one sentence here that says the remuneration paid to the CEO in 2013 was $1.150313 million. All right, but again, no detail what was cash, what was equity, how that pay was justified. And if we wanted to, we could go and look at the same sort of information for 2014, and you see the same kind of detail. There's one sentence because this person is not on the board, and then there's just a list of other employees who earned more than $100,000 and the number of individuals paid within those bandwidths. Compare that to telecom, and I'm going to look in the 2009-2012 Paul Reynolds era. And Mr. Reynolds, as has already been mentioned today, very high base salary. He was awarded a base salary of $1.75 million a year. His short-term incentive is then based as a proportion of that base salary. So the higher the base salary that you can negotiate, the greater the short-term incentive payments you will receive. In 2009 to 2012, he was paid, in addition to his base, between an extra $240,000 and $332,000 a year for personal travel expenses back to the UK. So telecom shareholders, in addition to awarding him a huge base salary plus cash incentives, also paid for him to go back to the UK every year with his family and accommodation and other travel expenses associated with that. His performance awards were based on a ratio of 60% cash, 40% shares, and you'll see if when I show you in a moment, if you read the statements, the board at its discretion actually chose to pay him out in 2 of the years that we'll look at in a full cash reward rather than giving him 40% equity, 60% cash. Why, as a shareholder, should you be concerned with that? The idea of giving equity in your payment scheme is to motivate the individual to increase the value of the firm over time, which should be reflected in a higher share price. If I give you the option of taking cash today and putting it in your pocket versus cash and some equity, which you then can receive added value from in the future if the firm does well, you're going to take the cash because there's no accountability. Mr. Reynolds was brought in, and it was made very clear at the beginning of his appointment to separate Chorus from what is now known as Spark. He exited in 2012, and his cash exit payment was $9.15 million. That included a cash performance incentive payment which was related to performance measured in 2011. He had a $1.75 million cash termination payment. That's in addition to his base $1.75 million he would have been paid in 2012. And he also received a cash incentive payment in 2012 of $2.1 million. So a very well paid man. And I'm just going to show you briefly how, again, the information is disclosed, because without an understanding of how these reports are prepared and what is required for a reader to be able to identify that information, you can't really appreciate how difficult it is for the majority of the shareholding, which is quite diversified, so they're very small shareholders, to have the time and actually the ability to be able to read these documents. Okay, find a page number, a wee bit further. 138. All right, so this is going to be small. Whoops. So it's just disclosed at the end of a page, and all the detail around how these payments are actually determined. So there's retirement allowances, here's the remuneration policy, how termination payments are going to be dealt with. But there you can see, so this is the 2011 report. It's going to be small, but there's the base, 1.75 million. There's the short-term incentive at risk payment, and the footnote describes how it should be 60% cash, 40% equity. However, the gross amount earned for financial years 2010-2011 was 900,000 New Zealand dollars, 60% award in cash, 40% in equity, which was paid out in shares. And he also got some other equity incentive to try and give him a long-term payment, and there's the travel payments for 2011, the $373,074. So you can see that while in theory it's a good idea to have your CEOs, to have your shareholders actively monitoring what's going on, they're trusting a lot to their board. All right, if those directors are setting these pay compensation packages, they need to ensure that obviously the CEO is being awarded according to what's actually being achieved, and also they're being accountable to their shareholders. Last example was Contact. Contact in 1999 and 2000, Contact went public, right? So it was listed on the stock exchange, and Paul Anthony was hired to be able to undertake that transfer of ownership. Part of his contract involved a base salary of $450,000, and in addition to that, he was awarded a performance bonus of up to 50% of his base salary. So again, the higher your base salary, the more you can get paid. He also had built into his contract a sort of termination backstop. So if he was to stay with the firm beyond May 24th of 2000, then he would be paid in cash the value of 330,000 shares in the firm based on their share price on May 24th of 2000. You can see what his pay was in each of the years that we're looking at, and I just want to show you this termination contract and the way it was set up, because most shareholders probably didn't appreciate what this meant in terms of the actual amount of money that he received for the services that he provided to Contact. Now, the nice thing about Mr. Anthony, he was a managing director and a CEO, so his disclosures are detailed under the requirements of the Companies Act. And you can see there's the full amount that he was paid in 1999. And up here, there are a couple of clauses, one explaining the base salary, and here is this agreement that provided he doesn't terminate his employment before May 24th of 2000, he'll receive this cash payment, which he did receive, and it was just under $1 million. So he made another $1 million by staying with the firm, and he did actually leave the firm later that year in September. So you see, these compensation contracts, while it might be argued, are set to attract highly talented people who have a great deal of skill, who will add benefit to the firm, there are a lot of other contributing factors that often individuals are unaware of from an average reader's perspective. So someone who maybe glances at the financial report or doesn't read the financial report at all and possibly just attends the annual general meeting. So what's actually happened when I look at the payment in terms of real median, all right, I'm not going to use mean because it's a skewed data set, some very highly paid individuals and some very lowly paid individuals. So we look at the median in the middle, when we look at the lower half and the upper half of the sample, what has happened to median cash compensation in real terms measured in $1997 over that 15-year window that we currently have. So the blue column is cash, so you can see except around sort of the financial crisis time, cash has steadily been increasing. Along with that, I have a total CEO pay measure, which is the value of cash plus any equity incentives that are offered in that year for the first time. So that could be the value of options or shares as part of an incentive scheme. And then what's really interesting is this green measure, which is the wealth measure. And wealth is looking at the value of cash plus new equity plus the change in the value of any existing equity contracts. Because in any given year, based on what happens to the riskiness of the cash flows and the value of the shares, those option contracts before they're exercised, or those rights programs, can actually go down in value or go up. Right? But overall we see that again, wealth dropped off over that crisis period, but it's been increasing and is substantially higher when we look at the value in 2012. And that small purple bar along the bottom is the median worker income based on Statistics New Zealand income survey data. All right, so you can see a significant difference between what the median pay is to typical worker in New Zealand in each of those years relative to what these CEO pay contracts look like. So the other thing I did is I looked at, and again this is just for cash, but we can look at other measures of pay as well. So again, in real terms, what is the mix, what's the proportion of individuals earning within a certain range of dollars? So below 200,000, 200,000 or below, then between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and more than $500,000 a year. How many individuals who are employed as CEOs in public listed companies? And you can see in the end of the 90s, it was just a small portion, about 10% of all those being paid as CEOs were paid more than $500,000 a year. And what's happened is that section of the population has pushed. So now closer to 50%, or at least 50% of all of those individuals employed as CEOs in New Zealand public listed companies are now earning, in terms of cash alone, around $500,000, or actually more than $500,000 a year. And obviously the ones in the lower earning area, below 200,000, 200 below, is dropped down to 10%, and there's been some sort of juggling in the mid-bandwidth. But certainly marked increase in the number of individuals who are being paid more than $500,000 a year now. If we go to the wealth measure, because the wealth measure is probably a better indicator overall of what's happening to the value of these individuals' pay packets, and we see the same picture but even more so, all right? So when we include the added value of equity compensation together with what they take in cash, we see that actually almost 60% of that population is now earning more than $500,000 a year, compared to about 10% back in 1997 when this data first became available. All right, I've talked about equity incentives. I haven't really referred to them in a lot of detail. The Compensation Committee has a huge responsibility. They need to make sure that this individual is working in the best interest of the shareholders. They are part of the elected group on the board, so they will be directors from the overall board, and they have to determine how best to negotiate a contract that will motivate this individual to keep them accountable to the benefits of the shareholder, and also allow that person to act in a way that won't make them too risk averse. All right, so they want to be able to take on projects that will add value to the firm over time, and do so in such a way that they don't compromise the value of the firm or feel too restricted in terms of the risk they wish to take on based on their own personal risk with the human capital investment. It's supposed to be an arm's length setting process, so that means that this board, this group of individuals, goes away and individually determines a contract, then it's negotiated with the CEO and they come to an agreement. But obviously if your CEO is on your board, then there's going to be some group dynamics. Management literature will tell us that that arm's length process will probably be compromised, and essentially if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, especially those executive directors who will be also having pay negotiations with the CEO, will be acting in their best interests as well as those of the CEO and the working relationship that they have. So there's an agency relationship here, an agency relationship between the shareholders, who are the owners, and the CEO, who is the principal, and sorry, he's the agent, and the relationship between those two and the way that's managed through the board of directors. So the idea is we want to align those interests. Options were quite popular for a while, so that was a contract where you had the opportunity at some point in the future to become a shareholder, provided you met performance incentive requirements and you would be awarded a certain number of shares. The downside of the option is that once the option is exercised, most of these contracts have no requirement that the shares be held for any length of time. So the CEO can automatically turn around and sell the shares as soon as they've been awarded and realise the capital gain. So while it's long-term over a 3 to 5 year period while the options are held and become valuable, once they're exercised, then new incentives have to be put in place in order to renegotiate that same sort of alignment between incentives of the shareholder and the incentives of the CEO. So when we look at CEO pay versus worker income, and again this is all in real terms, and I've broken the sample down a little bit because I have put my mean measures in here as well, and I've got my median measures. I'm going to focus on the median measures. So I have the level in 1997, the median level, and the median level in 2012, and you can see that's quite realistic because we saw there are years there, 2011, more than $3 million was paid in cash alone to one particular CEO. How has that change in cash compensation in real terms, what does that look like? So you can see between 90-94% increase over that 15-year period, and on an annual basis, so if we talked about compounding growth, CEOs, if we look at median level of cash payment alone, have experienced 5% growth per annum consistently over 15 years. Now in my total compensation, I call it subsample because not all firms have equity contracts, so to make things comparable, what I've done is I've taken only the firm's cash compensation measure if they also have equity contracts in place, all right? So again, we see significant growth in cash and also cash plus equity incentives that are issued for the first time. And again, around an annual 4% compounded growth over 15 years. And if we look at wealth, so remember wealth is the value of change in equity over time. So if I hold shares and the share price goes down, between this financial year and last financial year, then I have less wealth than I did previously, so we take that into account. And you can see that significant change in wealth from the mean point of view, but if we look at the median, still, we've more than doubled our wealth over 15 years, and we're talking about on a year-on-year compounded growth rate of about 6%. So what about workers? Well, you can see workers pale in comparison. We're talking 15% growth over 15 years, so pretty much 1% per year. All right, compared to up to possibly 17% if we look at mean levels. And if we look at that all-important gap between what the worker, the average annual income for, as surveyed by Statistics New Zealand, we can see that median CEOs are earning about 16 times. It's a bit lower than what Eric said. He said 25 times, but if we go to some of those higher paid CEOs, we'd see that ratio would be around 25 to 35 times. And that's what it looks like if I take, similar to what Eric did, if we take a base level of 100 in 1997 and then we measure relative to that level what's happened to pay to CEOs in terms of cash plus new equity or wealth relative to what's happened to the income paid to your typical rank and file workers, you can see obviously that the pay to the CEO is much higher. Conclusions. So there is, I think, a large and growing gap between average CEO pay and average worker pay in New Zealand. I think that that change over the 15 years in pay level has been notable. Median CEO cash to CEO pay gap has doubled. All right, and it's increased from 9 times to around 16 times median worker income. Obviously, compensation to CEOs is growing at a faster rate than average worker pay, and we see that CEO wealth has more than doubled, whereas worker income grew at about 1% per annum over that 15-year window. I think firms need to look at ways to distribute the wealth of the firm amongst all the stakeholders. And again, questions arise, are some of these individuals being overpaid? So the argument on one side of the fence is that they're especially skilled, we need to pay them in order to keep that talent within our organisation. The other side of the argument is that you may be overpaying these individuals and they're not necessarily maximising the value of the shareholders' wealth. The results suggest that we need to look at how CEO pay has been set. Certainly the 3 examples I gave you, there are payments there that I think any shareholder would like to challenge if they were to think a little bit more carefully about the amount being paid and how it was being paid, sometimes against what had previously been written in the contract in the case of telecom. And I think definitely further work needs to be done at looking at the influence that the CEO has in the pay setting process, certainly within New Zealand, where you have CEOs who do still sit, even in a de facto relationship, on their compensation committees and certainly are actively involved in their boards. All right.